Hey everyone, nice to see you all in here. So for today's class, we are going to continue our discussion on the observational theoretical distinction. And we will see how our new philosopher, Bas Van Fraasen, disagrees with Putnam's view on the distinction. So as we notice, so we need to kind of refresh our memories. As we notice, Putnam argues that the observational theoretical distinction doesn't make much sense when we notice that in order to even capture or understand the observable, it requires some theoretical commitments. And so, therefore, it doesn't really make sense to say that you and I exist, or that we know, like I know as a fact that I exist or that you exist, but I'm unclear that the atoms that make you up exist. Putnam thinks that that's, if you take the object made up by atoms to exist, then you must also be committed to the existence of the atoms themselves, since the larger object is comprised of the atoms. We'll see Van Fraasen say something different. So he's going to be what I call more epistemically frugal. And what that means is he's just less inclined to be committed to the existence of things that are not directly observable by means of the naked human eye. So things that require a microscope to be observed, things that require, like the case of atoms where we use Brownian motion to observe them. In those cases, says Van Fraasen, we can't be sure that the entity in fact exists, that the atoms in fact exist, because when we look at, these things either under a microscope or through other means like Brownian motion, we're only seeing an indirect image of that thing. We're not directly perceiving it like the way me and you can directly perceive each other without the help of technology, without the help of, therefore, a microscope or, the use of Brownian motion for the case of atoms. But before we get into Van Fraasen's position, let's refresh our memory about Putnam's position. So remember, Putnam claims that the whole case of distinguishing entities that are directly observable versus not, and therefore having this distinction between the theoretical versus observational. He says that this distinction is just untenable. It doesn't work. When we actually analyze the reasons for distinguishing the two, we notice that for the things we claim to be theoretical, in a lot of ways, they're observational. And for the things that we claim to be observational, like me and you, let's say, things that are directly perceived by means of the human eye, in a lot of ways, those are theoretical as well. So even making sense of, what I am or what you are requires some language, requires some theory. And so once we kind of notice that, this distinction starts to kind of fall. And so I will start the chat with the following question. What is Putnam's argument for why the observational / theoretical distinction is untenable? So why does he think it's untenable? What's his argument? Well, let's reflect on it together. So notice first, sorry. I'm going to write this in the chat. So first notice that observational entities like me and you and the table and the computer and the chair, observational entities, things that are directly observable by the human eye or by our senses, they're made up of smaller units of matter, right? So as we all know, it's not the case that I was just born in my full form as Alicia, right? I started as a little fertilized egg and then an embryo, and then later developed, over time into a person. And so we can see and we understand just with our modern science that yes, we are these composite objects that are made up of parts. Now, once we kind of notice that, or we accept this fact, Putnam says it starts to become unclear how we have observable objects without helping ourselves to the existence of simpler theoretical entities that are supposed to comprise the larger observable object. So what Putnam says is, look, if you're already willing to say, which we all are unless we're just kind of a total skeptic, but as we all are in this class, we're willing to say this whiteboard exists, my hair exists, the window there exists, right? Because we can directly perceive these things. Just as we're committed to the existence of these things through my direct sense perception, I feel this whiteboard, I can hear it, I can see it for sure. We must also, therefore, without a doubt, be committed to the parts that make up this larger object. So the small atoms that comprise this larger whiteboard. You can't get one without the other, says Putnam. So if you think the whiteboard exists and you know that the whiteboard is made up of parts, which we do know, then you must also think that the parts that make up this whiteboard, the atoms, that they also exist, even if you can't directly perceive the atoms, okay? Even if you can only perceive them under a microscope or through Brownian motion, that's okay, right? That's enough to say that atoms exist, okay? Here's another thing Putnam says. Scientific progress is predicated on the discussion of theoretical entities. If science was confined to merely the observable, we wouldn't be able to talk about things like quantum mechanics, black holes, a whole bunch of stuff, surface reflectance distributions of objects, et cetera, et cetera. So here's another thing Putnam points out. He's like, look, when it comes to science, we help ourselves to the existence of things that are not directly observable. And it's important that we help ourselves to that, because oftentimes this is what scientific progress is predicated on. So we believed most generally, I mean, some scientists weren't sure, but in general, the scientific community came to believe that atoms existed even before there was any way to even indirectly perceive an atom. In medicine, right, we subscribe to the existence of viruses, for example, even though it's not like a virus is something you can directly see, right? But we still claim that it exists because of its, because of how it can affect things in the world. We know that when someone has a virus versus not, we understand the ramifications and the effects of having that virus. And so that seems sufficient, of course, according to Putnam, to claim that the virus does in fact exist. And he says if we don't help ourselves to the existence of things like the virus, when we can't directly observe it, but we only observe its effects on the human body, if we can't help ourselves to the existence of the virus in this case, then it's unclear how scientific progress would ever work in medicine. Because often we notice that a lot of medical advancements have to do with stopping certain viruses. And of course, that wouldn't happen unless we actually thought the virus did exist independently of our perception of it, even though we can't directly perceive it. Okay, so that's another point he makes. So he's like, scientific progress requires this, is another thing he's saying. Like, we can't really do science without being committed to the existence of things we can't directly perceive. And let me put this third point. So I'm going to break this up. Sorry. Okay, let me just break this up into parts so I can write this all in the chat. So one moment. And then also Putnam says, look, it actually makes no sense to make this distinction. So it's actually, it's untenable. It's not a argument that's going to work, or it's not a position that makes much sense. This position of making the distinction between the observable versus theoretical, and being unclear about our commitments to the theoretical while still being committed to the existence of the observable. He's like, they just work together. Either you're committed to the existence of both or not. And why? Because of the following. He says, if we are confined to merely the observable, then we cannot talk about features of objects that exist independently of our experience of them. So again, let me just say that one more time. If we are confined merely to the observable, then we cannot talk about features of objects that exist independently of our experience of things, experience of those objects. How we observe things in the world is dependent on our perceptual apparatus, which has just been created over, thousands and thousands of years through the process of evolution. But notice that it's unclear to what extent our observations, the way we perceive things as human beings, whether those observations are quote unquote correct. Okay. Now, what does he mean in this last point? Well, let's again use our kind of easier example of color, right? So with regards to color, let's say this is this is grass. Okay? And this is me, let's say, looking at the grass. And here's some facts. I'm a trichromite. So trichromatic. So here's me looking at the grass. So imagine I'm just outside and I'm looking at the grass. And I think to myself, the grass is green. This seems to be an objective fact about the grass. I tell you the grass is green. Now, we all come to believe the grass is green, me, you, and our other trichromat human buddies. But now notice if another organism is looking at the same grass, let's say this is a dog. Okay. So for the dog, when the dog looks at the grass, the dog is a dichromat. Meaning the dog has one less cone in its color vision system. So when the dog looks at the grass, the dog sees, something not as vivid as what we see. So the dog will see something like more grayish and brownish because the dog does not have the extra cones we have to make clear distinctions between green and red. Okay, so the dog is going to be like, let's say, if the dog is thinking to itself, of course, it's not going to be thinking in language like us, but let's just pretend the dog will think to itself, the grass is, I don't know, a brownish color. Okay. So the dog is going to see something totally different with regards to color than what we see. And now imagine a further organism, like a stomatopod. I don't really know how to draw that. Okay. A stomatopod has even more cones than us everyday humans. And so a stomatopod sees more colors than the average person. And so you can therefore think, maybe not in the case of looking at the grass, but there are going to be instances where a stomatopod is going to look at the same object as me and you and see additional colors that we do not see. Okay? And so, given this example, notice we can ask ourselves, okay, who has the correct color perception? Is it me? Is it the dog? Is it the stomatopod? Which one of us, which organism is having the right or the objective or the correct color perception? And in this case, as we saw last class, this question doesn't really make sense. So this question I'll write in the chat: who is having, me, the dog, or the somatopod? Who is having the correct color perception? As we saw kind of last week, this is somewhat of a silly question, correct? Because now, as we know a little bit more about the visual system and how vision works, we know that grass, it just has what's called a surface reflectance distribution, an SRD, meaning that it just reflects this distribution of light waves. And all that implies is, depending on what organism you are, depending on what your cones are like in the retina, you're going to pick up the same surface reflectance distribution and see different colors. Okay, so none of us have the correct objective color perception. Instead, it's just the object has this surface reflectance distribution, that it's a distribution, so it's it can be kind of interpreted by different vision systems in different ways. Given the types of cones you have, you're going to interpret the color in a different way. And as we therefore notice, there is no objective color. There is no objective color to the grass. It's not objectively green, and these two guys are wrong. Or it's not objectively brownish, and the human and the somatopod are wrong. Or it's not objectively, I don't know, the colors the somatopod sees that we don't see, like ultraviolet or something. And, me and the dog are wrong. No, it's just that the object, the grass, has this kind of loose, or this kind of interpretable surface reflectance distribution. And then depending on what kind of vision system, the kind of retina or cones the organism has, it will interpret that distribution differently. Okay? And now this example, I think, is kind of nice to illustrate Putnam's point, because we notice that, yes, this question about who has the correct color perception of the grass is a silly question, because the object, again, just contains a surface reflectance distribution that gives off different features depending on the types of cones the observer has. Discussion of a reflectance distribution in vision science is a discussion of, now something, notice, a theoretical object, since it goes beyond our perceptual experience. So now when we talk about color perception as psychologists and physicists, notice we have to talk about something the grass contains that we cannot directly perceive, right? So what we found out as scientists is like, okay, objects contain a distribution, a surface reflectance distribution, and that does not perfectly correspond to the colors we see. And therefore, notice now the concept of a surface reflectance distribution. This now starts to become a theoretical concept. It's theoretical, at least on this distinction, because we can't directly perceive the distribution. The whole point is we only see the distribution in a specific way, given how we evolved, given the cones that we have. And so, strictly speaking, the distribution itself is a theoretical object. But now notice how weird and puzzling the implication would be for color if we accepted this distinction. The implication would be that the color green is real and objective. The color green is something that exists because it's something observational. But now the surface reflectance distribution that causes our color perception of green is theoretical, meaning that we can't assume it exists. That seems odd. In the same way, Putnam says, look, if you're committed to the existence of me or this whiteboard or yourself right now watching this video, then you have to be committed to the existence of the atoms that make you up. Otherwise, it doesn't make much sense. You're committed to your own existence, but you think that the smaller parts that make you up, that can't be directly perceived, the atoms, that they don't exist, or you're not sure that they exist, well, then how can we possibly explain your existence? So Putnam's like, this distinction just doesn't make sense. Either we say I exist and the atoms that make me up exist, or green exists and the surface reflectance distribution exists, or we say they both don't exist. But to say that the color green exists, but now the surface reflectance distribution that brings about the color green does not exist, that just makes no sense, says Putnam. So the distinction, according to him, just makes no sense. So our perceptual experiences, they're just one way of interpreting the world amongst many, right? It's just a contingent feature of our evolutionary past that we perceive the way the world is for us. We could have been a bat. I could have been a bat that can't really see much at all and instead perceives the world through echolocation, or even a human that's born blind, right? One of my really good friends, one of my best friends who's blind, like, she can't see objects in the same way we do, of course, but she has an amazing sense of sound. Like, she can hear things so well that she uses that almost kind of echolocation to make sense of where she's at on campus. So now notice, like, we can't just say what exists is dependent on your particular perceptual experiences, or mine, or ours in general, because it's just a contingent, random kind of evolutionary fact that we perceive the things the way that we do as human beings. We could have evolved to be more like bats. We could have evolved to be more like stomatopods or dogs, etc. So Putnam says, if we're confined to the observable, if we only can say that observable stuff exists, if we actually believe in this distinction, it starts to become unclear how we can have fruitful discussion of our experiences, since I can't observe the larger object, or the color green, without also being at least implicitly committed to the existence of something theoretical or not directly observable. The atoms that make me up, or in this case, the surface reflectance distribution that gives rise to the color perception. Okay. He also says this like a little bit deeper argument. Okay. Here's the deeper argument. Let me put this in the chat first. Okay. So he also says this kind of deeper point. He's like, why would we really, why would we privilege the things that are directly observable? Why would we privilege those as the things that do in fact objectively exist? And as a result, then not be committed to the existence of things that are not directly perceivable. Like, why would we do that? Because he says, when you really think about your perceptions or your observations, you'll start to notice that your observations, again, they're just based on how you experience things. But now, once you realize, okay, my observations, they concern my experience of something, then what you start to notice is the things that are directly perceivable, or the things that we can directly sense with our five senses, have to do with our own experiences. I can only directly experience the experiences I'm having, and I can't directly experience experiences I'm not having. And therefore, he says, I just have to make the theoretical assumption, or I just have to therefore be committed to this idea that our experiences, mine and yours, let's say, are mostly the same. So let me backtrack again. Notice the only thing that I can directly perceive are my own experiences. Everything in the universe is being kind of filtered or mitigated through my brain, through my perceptual apparatus. And so the only thing I experience directly, strictly speaking, is my own experiences. But now notice how, like, if we don't just kind of be blindly committed that our experiences are similar to one another, if we're not committed to that, then we start to notice that it's unclear. Like I can't establish as a matter of fact that the way I see this color here is the exact same way you see it. For all I know, you're colorblind or you're a dichromat, like the dog, or for whatever reason you're not seeing this color in the same way. I don't know for sure that me and you perceive things in the same way. I just assume that we do. And notice this is an important assumption, because if I didn't assume so, then I wouldn't ever be able to make any claims about colors or any qualities of anything I experience. Because then I'd always be wondering, well, for all I know, my experience of things is different than theirs. They might be seeing something totally different than me. And I would never be able to answer or verify whether I'm correct or not in that claim. Like, do you see things different than me or the same? I'm never going to be able to answer that question, because it can never go inside your mind and have your subjective experience. I'll never have the experience of being you. I have no idea what it's like to be you. You have no idea what it's like to be me. And we'll never know. I'll never know how you see this video. I'll never know how you see this color. And you'll never know how I see this color. But now notice we both assume that we're seeing color in the same way, because without this assumption, we couldn't really talk about anything objectively. We couldn't have science. And so therefore, once we notice that, we start to realize, well, wow, this distinction really doesn't make sense, because the only thing I'm directly observing ever are my own experiences. And because I don't know, I can never, let's say, directly observe your experiences. Then, however you're experiencing things are now considered something theoretical to me. I don't know if your experiences of this actually exist. But now, if we really took that to heart, then everything besides your own experience of things is something that can be called into question. And as a result, we can never talk about objects outside of us as having any objective properties at all. Because for all I know, the only reason why the grass is green is because of some random feature of Alicia. And that's different across human beings. But now we would never be able to talk objectively about the color of grass or any property of the grass. And so what Putnam says is, look, when you really are committed to this distinction, you kind of fall into this very skeptical position about the existence of things. You start to slip into like this view that, okay, either I'm committed, or you start to slip into this view where you cannot be sure that anything outside of you and your experience of it actually exists. That's skepticism. And skepticism has nothing to do with science. I mean, in science, we actually assume the opposite of skepticism. We just assume that the way I perceive things is akin to the way you perceive things. We have to assume that. Otherwise, we would never have any objective observations of anything. And now once we notice that, then we start to notice, yes, unless I'm going to be a total skeptic and claim that the only thing I know that really exists is my experience of things, unless I'm going to just say that, then I really have to, agree with Putnam that this distinction between the observational and theoretical, it doesn't really make much sense. Okay. Now, Bas Van Fraasen, he's going to disagree with Putnam. He's going to most generally disagree with them. At the beginning, though, he has some remarks where he agrees with Putnam. So let me just make that clear. Here's kind of Van Fraasen's argumentative strategy. He's like, here are the ways me and Putnam actually perfectly agree. But notice that Putnam is wrong about X, Y, and Z. So he's going to start by agreeing with Putnam, and then later he's going to illustrate some of the issues with Putnam's position. And so that generates the disagreement. And then hopefully for your guys' homework assignment, you can write on this debate between Putnam and Bas Van Fraasen, and then argue which view you find to be more tenable. So let's get now started on what Bas Van Fraasen believes. So Bas Van Fraasen, he's a very famous philosopher of science. I'm going to write his name in the chat. He is very much like a skeptic. So he is what we call an anti-realist. He's very he is not committed to the existence of objects that are not directly perceivable. So in other words, Van Fraasen is going to be like, I don't really know if atoms exist in the way that we claim they do in chemistry and physics because we've never directly observed them. So how would we know? Yeah, maybe I know they exist in some respect because I'm a larger object made up of parts. And so I have to claim if I exist because I could directly perceive myself, then the parts that make me up must exist. But now we can't really say much about the nature of the parts that make me up because they're not directly perceivable. That's Von Frausen's view. And now notice, therefore, he actually does believe in the distinction and he thinks it's important, unlike Putnam. Okay? So now let me now say a little bit more. So Bas Van Fraasen, he actually agrees with Putnam and also this other philosopher of science, Maxwell. He agrees with Putnam and Maxwell that we cannot divide language into theoretical versus non-theoretical. So he kind of agrees with this linguistic point, like this distinction between theoretical versus non-theoretical starts to get fuzzy because everything in science is theory-laden, since the only things that are directly observable are sense experiences. So I can directly observe, for example, a red ball. But notice, so let me be crystal clear. Putnam makes this argument, and this is the part I'm trying to articulate to you that Van Fraasen agrees with. So again, unless you're going to be a total skeptic and only think that what exists are your experiences of things, unless you're going to go down that route, you have to start to kind of notice that distinguishing things between theoretical and non-theoretical, most generally, it starts to make little sense because the stuff that we would claim is non-theoretical, so the stuff that's directly observable, like the color of the grass. So the grass is green. I'm listening to lecture right now. Professor is wearing black. Okay, those directly perceivable things, they are perceivable, correct? But now notice we only make sense of these perceptions with the use of language. So you only make sense of this perception of my shirt as black with the use of language. In other words, if you and a baby were watching this video, notice that you and a baby would have the exact same experiences. Let's assume the baby is similar to you as it's a trichromat. It's not a colorblind baby. Now you and the baby are going to have the same experiences of, me in this video and whatever. But now notice though, because you have language and the baby doesn't, your experiences are very different in this deep and important way. You're going to see this video and make sense of the sentences. Professor's wearing a black shirt. The grass is green on the board, or the marker or the writing on the board is green. Okay, you can think these thoughts and perfectly make sense of it, and it organizes your experience. Now, even though the baby is having the exact same experience as you, because the baby does not have language, it will not be able to agree that professor's shirt is black or, the marker she used was green. Because the baby, even though it's seeing the exact same things as you, it doesn't have language yet to organize what it's seeing. And so this is kind of further evidence to illustrate that, yes, like a part of everything we perceive, there's something theoretical. There's this extra language stuff that's being used to guide our experiences. And we can't, strictly speaking, we cannot confirm whether this extra language stuff is actually true or not. Okay, and so therefore, what kind of Von Fraasen and Putnam notices is that once a human like us starts to, have a language, then strictly speaking, all of their perceptions take on this theoretical aspect, because it's now not just the direct sense experience. It's like using language to organize that sense experience. And when we're using language to organize our sense experience, we have this extra thing, this extra theoretical thing, namely that our language can capture the structure of what we see in reality. That language can capture the structure of the grass, that it's green. That language can capture, the structure of what you're seeing right now. And therefore you can claim that I'm wearing a black shirt. Okay. But now without the language, we wouldn't be able to organize our perceptions, and therefore we wouldn't be able to communicate them. We wouldn't be able to even have like a discussion about anything. And so once we notice that language is very much required to even make sense of our perceptual experiences, then the theoretical is unavoidable. And making the distinction, therefore, between the theoretical and observable starts to break down. Okay, so far, Bas Van Fraasen is agreeing with Putnam. But however, even though he agrees with Putnam on this point, he is still going to claim that there is a way to make a legitimate distinction between observable versus non-observable, between observable versus theoretical. He's just like, the way people have formulated the distinction thus far in the literature, yeah, that doesn't work. But in principle, we can give a good distinction. Okay? So, what's the distinction according to Von Fraasen? Well, here is how Von Fraasen distinguishes between the observable and the theoretical, though it really just sounds very much like the same distinction we've discussed thus far. So Von Fraasen says, the observable things are the types of things we can see with the naked human eye, in principle. Okay? To see that thing doesn't necessarily require technological assistance. So what are the things that are observable and therefore we can automatically claim that they exist? The things that you can see directly with the naked human eye. So, with the naked human eye, what are the things that you can see directly or perceive directly? And okay, you're like, I can perceive the green here, I can perceive the black shirt, I can perceive the desk in front of me. Okay, these things exist because I can directly perceive them with my eye. Okay, so what exists? My black shirt, each other, me making the video, you watching the video, this whiteboard, Jupiter when I look out in the night sky and I see the planet Jupiter. Okay, these things all exist, and they exist. We know that they exist without any further thought or assumption. Why? Because they're directly observable. We can observe these things with the naked eye. Now, what are the unobservable things? The things that are unobservable are the things that can only be observed with technological assistance. Okay, so if that thing can only be observed with some technological assistance, whether a microscope or Brownian motion used to observe electrons, then we can't claim that we know for sure that those things exist. It's not like we can just take for granted that those things exist. Why? Because we can't perceive them with the naked human eye. We require technological assistance to perceive these things. And so when we look at, let's say, something under the microscope, we can't say that those features, like the cell or whatever, like let's say the plant cell, we can't claim that those features actually exist because we're not actually really looking at the plant cell. We're looking at a microscope's image of the plant cell. And therefore, the things that we perceive with the assistance of technology, those things, we can't say exist in the way that we perceive them by using the technology. Now, things start to get a little puzzling quick because notice I took off my glasses and actually took them off on purpose. So why might have I taken off my glasses? Well, I took off my glasses because notice that my glasses are a piece of technological development that helped me see. And so if it was up to my naked eye, if all the things that exist only as I perceive them with my naked eye, those are the only things that I can claim without further argument that they exist for sure. Then notice, even for someone like me who's not even blind or colorblind, I mean, just the fact that I have bad vision, I'm going to be committed to the existence of objects in a lot different of a way than a person who has good vision. So there, I'm just kind of pointing to you that there's in a lot of ways, Bas Van Fraasen, he starts to kind of trap himself in a hole. Like there's issues, I guess, with his position, but it's still, I think, interesting, and I think it's still some things you should argue for if you want to in your papers. So what does Van Fraasen think? He thinks that when we look at molecules, for example, under a microscope, we aren't directly observing the molecules. We're observing an image of these molecules. Okay, so therefore, when scientists, after Brownian motion, through Einstein and Perrin's work, when they, agreed that now atoms exist because we can indirectly perceive the atom through Brownian motion, or now more recently, we can indirectly perceive atoms through things like microscopes. Von Fraasen's gonna be like, look, that doesn't mean that atoms exist, because we can't directly perceive the atom. You can't directly perceive the atom with the naked human eye. And so when you look at the atom, or when you look at the molecule under a microscope, you can't say that that thing exists. You're just seeing an image of that thing. And we don't know if that image is accurate or not. That image of under the microscope might track what an atom is really like, or it might not. And so therefore, we don't really know if atoms exist. We don't really know if molecules exist. With atoms, it's even like more problematic, because Brownian motion was the first way to kind of indirectly perceive that atoms exist. But when we actually do this kind of experiment, all we really do directly perceive are the vapor trails of atoms that show erratic behavior, that therefore lead us to kind of the inference that these atoms must exist. But now this is an inference. We don't directly perceive the atoms. And so Van Fraasen claims we can't therefore claim that atoms exist in the same way we can claim me and you exist. Okay? Now, notice that this way in which Van Fraasen divides up observable versus non-observable is different than Putnam, because now Putnam, what he says is, okay, observable versus non-observable. That has to do with things that are in principle observable versus not. So like the original distinction that Putnam is talking about is like, okay, we distinguish between things like atoms and me and you and this whiteboard and the chalk and the table and the chair. Those things are distinct from things like ghosts, angels, demons, telepathy, psychic forces. Okay, this is the distinction. Things that are in principally unobservable, because they refer to something that cannot be directly observed, like ghosts, angels, demons, the soul, psychic energy. Okay, those things are different than even atoms, electrons, quarks, because at least atoms, electrons, quarks, in principle, we can observe these things with the microscope or whatever. That is the original distinction Putnam discusses. Now, notice Van Fraasen is a little more skeptical than that. He's like, it's not about observable in principle versus not. It's about things that you can directly observe through the naked eye, and things you can't. Okay. So here is what Van Fraasen thinks of the way Putnam is making this distinction. He claims the following. He's like, the way the observable versus non-observable, when we're thinking about it with regards to like ghosts, angels, demons versus like atoms, electrons, me, you, that way of distinguishing things, Putnam thinks is a trick. Because now it's a trick because, says Putnam, we cannot directly observe the atoms. We cannot directly observe them. And so they must be on the same kind of, they should be at the same level as ghosts, souls, angels, and demons. These other things we also cannot directly observe. Just because in principle we can observe them, because they are physical, in other words, doesn't imply that they're observable. So again, he has a stricter criteria of what he constitutes as observable. It has to be something that can be directly observed with the naked human eye. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. And now in the next video, I'm going to further develop Putnam's argument. Okay, thank you guys.